Hi everyone, welcome to Infinite Women. I'm Allison, and today I wanted to talk about the only woman problem in storytelling. And I'm going to specifically look at this from a superhero movie standpoint because that was my own jumping off point. So, around the time that Avengers Age of Ultron came out back in 2015, I read an opinion piece, and I'm so sorry I did try to find it again so that I could link it for you, but this was literally a decade ago. So if anyone can find it, please let me know. But anyway, this piece was talking about how in that movie, Age of Ultron, the Black Widow's main plot component was the reveal that she was forcibly sterilized. And this was getting called out. I would say rightfully so because of how writer-director Joss Whedon handled it, and I would say that's part of a whole larger conversation about him. But calling yourself a monster because you were sterilized against your will is deeply messed up, and I think there was also way more to say about women's bodily autonomy being stripped away that they just really didn't bother to explore because they're trying to compare her being forcibly sterilized, something that has actually been done to many women in the US and elsewhere in living memory, to Bruce Banner being made into the Hulk through a lab accident in his own lab. But I digress. The point of this piece was saying that regardless of how you feel about that part of the movie and how it was handled, it's much more of a problem because she is the only woman on the team. And this writer was pointing out that if you gender swapped any of the men in that film, it would also be problematic. Bruce can't control his emotions. Tony literally created the villain through his own arrogance and poor judgment, and women who are confident are often perceived as arrogant and less competent than they actually are. Thor is absent for a lot of the movie on his own side quest. Meanwhile, we meet Clint's family. So that's his big character aspect for the movie is him as a family man who would really rather just be at home with them. Steve is still pining over his lost love. Any of those things would probably get called out if they were the plot line for the only woman. The focus on her infertility is a problem because it's all we get to represent all women, similar to when you have one person of color, one queer person, etc., which I will come back to in a minute. But with that said, the MCU has a really awful track record with Black Widow in particular. Like, even if you just compare her death to Tony's in Endgame, they basically fridged her while explicitly saying that her life was worth less because she doesn't have a family, while Tony's got to be the climax, and then everyone who's ever been in one of these movies turned out for his funeral. But hey, God forbid it be a joint funeral with both their photos on display. Then the franchise doubled down, and after giving us the truly incredible WandaVision, basically destroyed any goodwill that they'd garnered from that with what they did to Wanda's character in Multiverse of Madness. So, yeah, it's not just the only woman in the room problem. The MCU has much bigger issues with women and diverse representation more broadly. But outside of an ensemble movie, I do want to mention that I don't actually have a problem with female characters being defined by their relationship to the male lead if we're talking about a movie like Aquaman, where basically every character is defined by their relationship to Arthur. Like, yes, Mira is the love interest and Atlana is the mom, but the other main characters are his mentor, his brother, his dad, and a nemesis seeking revenge against him specifically. Like, this is obviously super common regardless of the main character's gender. Though, I mean, you could compare it to a movie like Captain Marvel, where other than the Rambos and her trainer, most of the characters don't have a personal relationship with Carol Danvers. Not the Skrull, not the main villain, not Nick Fury, versus the Black Widow movie that we finally got. That's all about personal connections with other characters, but that's a whole other rabbit hole that I'm not going to go down right now. Promise. So let's switch gears to the Fantastic Four, which I will freely admit that I haven't seen first steps because it just didn't sound like something that I wanted to spend my time and money on. But again, the latest iteration got called out because Sue's character is basically mom. We're told that she's a scientist and a diplomat, but we don't really see any of that. It's all about maternity. And I mean, you could argue that Reed's anxiety about trying to protect everyone is clearly being exacerbated by being a dad. It's just that we see more of him outside of that, and that there is some conflict because he's prioritizing his work over things like putting the crib together. But that's because, unlike Sue, he is shown as doing more than being a dad, and arguably seeing those roles as more important than the at least more mundane aspects of parenthood. And this could be part of a larger issue of the film jumping into the story several years in, so we don't get to see the characters develop like you would with an origin story, a la the 2005 version, which I haven't seen in probably 20 years, but I do remember enjoying it. And yes, the Silver Surfer in this 2025 version is female coded, but I don't think anyone would really consider her a particularly fleshed out character. But let's go back to the Jessica Alba version of Sue. In the 2007 Silver Surfer sequel that we got there, she and Reed are getting married and considering stepping back from superheroing. And if that was the plot of the first movie, I'd be pissed. But we already had the first one to establish her as a smart, powerful woman. They didn't go straight into the version of her that's thinking about quitting to start a family and is pissed that her fiance is more worried about saving lives than their wedding. Which, to be fair, in context, their wedding is this huge, very public thing, and the pressure for it to be perfect would, let's be honest, be basically entirely on her. So I don't think she's being completely unreasonable here. But the presentation of 2025 First Steps Sue as primarily being a mom seems to be more a failing of skipping the origin story and the character development that we get with that. I personally wonder if they could have just made a third sequel to the 2005 version, if that might have worked better, because we've had a chance to give Sue that character development. And not just her. It would also have given more heft to Johnny as a reformed playboy, which he's supposed to be in First Steps. Because if it was a threequel, then we would have seen the playboy version played by Chris Evans. And no shade to Natasha Lyonne, but I would have loved to see them bring back Kerry Washington as Alicia Masters, who's Ben's love interest, and blind, and a woman of color. And if we're making it an age issue, because yes, it's been 20 years, Kerry Washington is only 2 years older than Natasha Lyonne. Ian Grufford, who played Reed back then, is only 2 years older than Pedro Pascal, who plays Reed in First Steps. And Jessica Alba and Chris Evans still look incredible as well, and in my opinion, could certainly play characters in their 30s. It could also have made the pregnancy more interesting if they had framed it as, she put off having kids because of superheroing, because they had already laid that groundwork for the can she have it all conflict between family responsibilities and work life. And now she's potentially got the complications of a geriatric pregnancy, which is just anyone who's over 35. But that's a more interesting plot line to me, and one that I think a lot of women could relate to more than having to choose between sacrificing your infant and saving the world. But there would also be that foundation that was built up over multiple movies. And just to go back to First Steps, there is also a women's bodily autonomy aspect in this film where, slight spoiler if you haven't seen it, the villain basically speeds up her pregnancy to suddenly force her into labor, which, again, I'm guessing this film that was written and directed by men does nothing to explore how that would have impacted her. To have your enemy be able to take control of your body in that way specifically, and the trauma that would probably cause, not just in the moment, but long term, because labor is often a very traumatic experience, both psychologically and physically. Not always, obviously, but often. There are mothers who have trouble bonding with their babies following difficult or traumatic birth experiences, even without the sci-fi aspect. So there are, once again, these larger real-life themes that they could have incorporated here. Now, all of that is to say, apart from I want to bring Jessica Alba back as Sue Storm. is that when you only have one female lead in an ensemble, and particularly when these films are largely written and directed by men, there is a care that needs to be given to these characters that is often lacking. And coming back to the other intersectionalities, the same applies with race, disability, queerness, etc. But those are often treated as we don't want to have to deal with this, so we just won't have any at all. Like, you notice how the original six Avengers were all white, apparently heterosexual, and able bodied? But it's much more obvious when you exclude women entirely compared to those other groups. So we get the one woman they can point to and see, oh, there, you happy now? And the irony here is that the answer to the only woman problem is literally just more women. There is a reason that increasing diverse representation beyond what I call CHOMs, cis het abled white men, is sort of the baseline when we talk about improving media. The characters in Ryan Coogler's Black Panther didn't have to represent all people of African descent, and the women in that movie are absolutely phenomenal. You've got the regal matriarch, the funny little sister who's also a tech genius, the loyal warrior, and the bleeding heart activist who's just trying to make the world a better place, in addition to being the love interest. And they all serve a purpose in the film. It's not just token female characters added at the last minute. And I think part of why this makes for better stories is that it is more reflective of reality, even when we're talking about superhero movies. With very few exceptions, women are everywhere, and those exceptions are usually ones where they've deliberately been kept out. But even then, if you're making a US Civil War epic, for example, there were women, whether they were nurses and doctors, women who had disguised themselves as men to enlist as soldiers, or what were known as vivandieres, who supplied goods to the soldiers. Even in a monastery, right? We have stories of saints who disguise themselves as men to become monks. But most of these only women stories are not even set in these gender dominated environments. Like, there really is no excuse. And another easy fix is gender swapping a male character to a female one. Everything Everywhere All at Once is probably the most phenomenal role of Michelle Yeoh's life, and she won an Oscar for that performance. And that character was originally going to be male. Like, the two male writer-directors actually wrote it for Jackie Chan. Also, it would probably be harder for people to call your plots sexist if they were originally meant for dudes, incidentally. But I would say that there are very few exceptions where gender swapping isn't a feasible option if you're willing to go down that path. All of that is to say, if you're going to be writing and directing any movie, whether that's an indie or a would-be summer blockbuster with a $200 million budget, and you can't manage to include more than one interesting, three-dimensional female character, that sounds like a skills issue, and maybe you shouldn't have gotten that job. Join us next time on Infinite Women, and remember, well-behaved women rarely make history.